Beijing had calculated that its economy was too large, too interconnected, and too essential to the global supply chain for any American president to truly confront it. However, the latest data from China's National Bureau of Statistics reveals something that has stunned economists from Washington to Frankfurt. For the first time in 4 decades, China's GDP growth rate has collapsed to zero. Not a slowdown, not a correction, zero. The engine that was supposed to power the 21st century has stalled completely, and the reverberations are now reaching every corner of the global financial system. In the first quarter of 2026, the world's second-largest economy produced nothing new. And the man responsible for this historic failure is now doing something that, just 18 months ago, would have been unthinkable. He is reaching out to Washington. The images you are about to see on your screens document this extraordinary moment in economic history. You will see the empty floors of Chinese factories that were once roaring 24 hours a day. You will see official Chinese government communications that reveal the panic concealed behind the polished facade of state media. But that is not the most shocking detail. There are 2 factors that drove China to this zero-growth catastrophe, and together they have created a trap from which Xi Jinping cannot escape without accepting terms that would have been considered humiliating surrender just 1 year ago. We will explain both in the later parts of this video. First, we must descend to the moment when the collapse began. On January 8, 2026, the United States Treasury Department announced the most comprehensive expansion of tariff measures against Chinese goods in American history. The new schedule imposed levies of 60% on all manufactured goods, 80% on semiconductor-adjacent products, and a complete embargo on 43 categories of advanced technology components. The announcement came following a National Security Council review that determined China had systematically violated the terms of every trade agreement signed since 2001. According to analysis from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the combined economic pressure of these measures represented a withdrawal of approximately $1.4 trillion in annual trade volume from China's export-dependent industrial base. The timing was surgical. It arrived precisely as China's property sector, which had already collapsed through the Evergrande and Country Garden crises, was beginning to drag the broader banking system toward insolvency. What the images reflected on the screen show is the consequence of that precision. The Guangdong manufacturing corridor, which employs an estimated 42 million workers and accounts for nearly 12% of China's total GDP, is now operating at 31% of its design capacity. Foxconn's Zhengzhou facility, which at peak production assembled 500,000 iPhones per day, has suspended 3 of its 7 primary assembly lines. The Yiwu commodity market, historically described as the world's largest small commodities wholesale center, recorded a 68% decline in international buyer traffic in February 2026 compared to the same month in 2025. These are not projections. These are documented, geolocated figures drawn from commercial satellite imagery and cross-referenced against port departure manifests obtained by Reuters and the Financial Times. This is where things get genuinely extraordinary, and this is the first factor that explains the zero-growth catastrophe. China's export model, refined over 30 years and optimized for one specific global condition, was built on a singular assumption that American consumers would always need Chinese goods more than China needed American markets. That assumption died in January 2026. According to preliminary data from the Peterson Institute for International Economics, China's export revenues fell by 44% in the first quarter of 2026 year over year. This was not a gradual decline. It was a cliff. Factories that had operated on razor-thin margins to undercut global competitors suddenly found their entire pricing architecture meaningless when faced with tariffs that made their products structurally uncompetitive regardless of the labor cost underneath them. There is a second factor that makes this even more devastating. We will get to that shortly. But first, we must look at what Beijing actually tried to do to stop this. Xi Jinping's initial response followed the playbook that had worked during every previous period of economic stress. The People's Bank of China cut its benchmark lending rate to 1.5% in February 2026, the lowest in the institution's history. The State Council announced a fiscal stimulus package nominally valued at 6.8 trillion yuan, approximately $900 billion. State media proclaimed that domestic consumption would replace export dependency, that Chinese citizens would buy the goods that American customers no longer could. According to analysis from the Institute for International Finance, the stimulus announcement produced approximately 11 days of positive market sentiment before reality reasserted itself. The reason it failed brings us to the second factor, and this one cuts deeper than tariffs. This is the structural wound that no stimulus package can close. China's youth unemployment rate reached 46.3% in March 2026, according to figures published by China's own National Bureau of Statistics before the Bureau abruptly suspended reporting of the metric in early April. The figure had been rising since 2023, when Beijing first suspended youth unemployment reporting after it exceeded 20%. The resumption of reporting followed immediately by its second suspension within 72 hours of the 46% disclosure. Tells you everything you need to know about the panic inside Zhongnanhai. A stimulus designed to drive domestic consumption cannot function when nearly half of the citizens aged 16 to 24 are unemployed. You cannot stimulate purchasing power that does not exist. You cannot replace 44% of your export revenue with domestic demand from a generation that cannot find work. The Keynesian architecture of Beijing's recovery plan collapsed the moment it met Chinese demographic reality. This brings us to the geopolitical dimension that has transformed a Chinese economic crisis into a global power realignment moment. The European Union, which had spent 3 years attempting to construct a diplomatic middle path between Washington and Beijing through its so-called de-risking framework, announced on March 3, 2026 that it would align its semiconductor export controls with the American schedule. This was not a symbolic gesture. The EU decision covered 41 categories of advanced manufacturing equipment, including the extreme ultraviolet lithography machines produced by the Dutch company ASML, which represent the single most critical bottleneck in China's attempt to develop a domestic advanced semiconductor industry. According to analysis from the Rhodium Group, China's access to sub-7 nanometer chip manufacturing technology has now been effectively blocked on a multilateral basis for the foreseeable future. The picture this creates is almost an exact parallel to the coordinated economic isolation campaigns of the Cold War, but with one crucial difference. The interdependence is far deeper and the unwinding far more painful for all parties. South Korea, whose annual semiconductor exports to China totaled approximately $68 billion in 2024, has now reduced that figure to $12 billion following its own alignment with American export controls. Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry implemented analogous restrictions covering advanced robotics and precision manufacturing equipment in February 2026. Trade volume between China and the combined G7 economies fell to its lowest level since 2004. The steel wall of economic containment that American strategic planners had been designing for a decade has, in the span of 4 months, become operational. Now let us look at what this means for the human beings trapped inside this collapsing system. The man behind the wheel of this economic catastrophe is not some faceless bureaucrat. The expression you see when Chinese officials appear in state media broadcasts is not confidence. It is the expression of people who have been caught in the gears of a system whose contradictions can no longer be managed through propaganda and suppression. Wang Yi, China's foreign minister, appeared before the National People's Congress on March 12th and delivered a speech that, read carefully, contains something remarkable, an implicit acknowledgement that Beijing's core economic strategy had failed. Not in those words, never in those words, but in the language of contingency, of adjustment, of new circumstances requiring new approaches. People who actually have leverage do not speak the language of adjustment. Xi Jinping's strategy until this moment had rested entirely on a single calculation. He believed that American political dysfunction, European commercial interests, and the general reluctance of democratic governments to absorb economic pain would prevent the kind of sustained coordinated pressure that could genuinely threaten Chinese economic stability. He trusted the election cycles in Washington and Berlin more than he trusted his own economic models. That calculation was not irrational given the preceding decade. It was simply wrong. And the evidence of how wrong it was appears in the single most remarkable diplomatic development of 2026. On March 28th, Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng arrived in Washington for meetings with Treasury Secretary and trade officials. This was not scheduled. It was not announced through regular diplomatic channels. According to reporting by the Wall Street Journal, the Chinese side initiated the contact. Beijing asked for the meeting. Think about what that means. The country whose official state media had spent 3 years describing American tariff policy as the death rattle of a declining hegemon, whose foreign ministry spokespersons had repeatedly characterized any American trade pressure as economic bullying destined to backfire, is now sending its second highest economic official to Washington to ask for relief. Not to negotiate from strength, not to counterpropose, to ask. The distance between the posture of January 2025 and the posture of March 2026 is not a tactical adjustment. It is a strategic collapse, and the terms Washington is reportedly discussing make the situation even more significant. According to preliminary reporting from Bloomberg and the Financial Times, the American side has presented a framework that includes not just trade concessions, but structural demands covering intellectual property enforcement, state subsidy transparency, and currency valuation practices. These are demands that Beijing has rejected categorically for 25 years. The fact that they are now on the table as the price of tariff relief is the clearest measure available of how dramatically the balance of leverage has shifted. Could Beijing walk away from these talks? It could, but the second quarter GDP data, which Chinese officials privately know will show continued zero or negative growth, arrives in July. The Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy is not built on ideology. It is built on the promise of material improvement. An economy that stops growing is not just an economic problem for Xi Jinping. It is an existential political problem. Here is what the coming months may look like. And this is the section of this analysis that most Western commentators are missing entirely. The scenario that appears likely is not a clean resolution. It is not a comprehensive trade deal that ends the confrontation. What the evidence points toward is a managed partial accommodation that reduces the immediate economic pressure on China while leaving the fundamental structural competition intact. Beijing will likely offer concessions on specific tariff categories covering agricultural goods and consumer products, areas where American exporters have genuine commercial interests and where Chinese concessions create visible domestic political wins for Washington. In return, Beijing will seek relief on the manufacturing sector tariffs that are most directly destroying employment. This means that the semiconductor restrictions, the advanced technology embargoes, and the export controls coordinated with American allies are almost certainly not going away. They are the instruments through which the United States and its partners are attempting to constrain China's long-term technological trajectory, and a partial trade accommodation does not alter that strategic objective. The truly chilling detail in this scenario is what it means for Taiwan. Every analyst examining Chinese military readiness doctrine has noted that economic stability and military adventurism are inversely related for Beijing. A China that is economically stressed, politically pressured, and internationally isolated is not necessarily a more cautious China. It may, paradoxically, be a more dangerous one. According to Institute for the Study of War Analysis published in March 2026, Chinese naval activity in the Taiwan Strait has actually increased during the current period of economic crisis, not decreased. The 500-kilometer arc of Chinese naval assets currently positioned across the Western Pacific represents a visible signal to domestic audiences that military prestige remains intact even as economic prestige crumbles. Whether that signal becomes an action is the question that will define the next chapter of this story. What you see on the screen today is the clearest picture of a great power's overextended calculation meeting the wall of reality. Russia thought it could use winter as a weapon in Ukraine. China thought it could use economic interdependence as a shield against pressure. In both cases, the calculation contained a fatal assumption that the opposition lacked the political will to absorb real costs in the pursuit of strategic objectives. In both cases, that assumption proved wrong. Xi Jinping arrived at this crisis not because he is unintelligent. He arrived here because he built a system optimized for a world that no longer exists, and the transition costs are now being paid by the 46% of Chinese young people who cannot find work. The coming months will determine not only the trajectory of the Chinese economy, but the terms on which the 21st century's defining great power competition is actually conducted. We are watching, in real time, whether economic coercion at scale can produce strategic concession. The data says the answer is yes. The timeline says we are at the beginning of that answer, not the end. Share your thoughts on this extraordinary situation in the comments section below. Do you believe China's economic capitulation is genuine, or is Beijing simply buying time for a longer strategy? Do not forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video. The story of what happens inside those Washington meetings and how Beijing responds when the second quarter data arrives is a chapter we will cover in detail as it unfolds. The engine that was supposed to power the 21st century has stalled. Whether it restarts, and on whose terms, is the question that matters now. Presented by TGN. Thank you for choosing us.